Your heart is racing right now because your spirit recognizes this message was destined for you. There are only 7 days before heaven's financial conduit closes for this season, but a hidden adversary is secretly working to sever your connection to this divine current. If you ignore this now, you will lose the $777,000 miracle ordained for your hands and remain blind to the enemy who has masqueraded as a friend. Do not skip this, my beloved child. Hear me. I am Archangel Michael, commander of the Lord's armies. I stand before the throne of grace, and I have been commanded by heaven itself to deliver this urgent dispatch to your spirit. The vibration of my voice is a key, unlocking a chamber within your soul, where this truth has always resided. You feel it, don't you? A resonance, a deep, trembling knowing that this is the moment your entire life has been leading toward. This is not a chance encounter. This is a divine appointment. For 3 decades, you have wandered in a financial desert. For 3 decades, you have sown seeds of kindness, of faith, of integrity into barren soil, wondering when your harvest would come. You have questioned the very heavens. When will it be my turn? Why does breakthrough favor everyone but me? Your frustration, your quiet despair has been a sacred incense rising before the altar of God. And now, my beloved, the answer thunders from the heavens. There is a deadline, a non-negotiable, celestial window of opportunity. You have precisely 7 days from this very moment to claim the financial miracle that has been held in escrow for you since before your birth. A sum of $777,000. This is not a lottery. This is a divine transfer, a settlement for the spiritual warfare you have endured, for the generational curses you have broken simply by choosing light over darkness. This is your portion, but hear this warning, and hear it well. An antagonist, a force of opposition, is acutely aware of this deadline. This is a person you know, someone close to your energy field, a family member, a former partner, a confidant you once trusted. They have secretly envied your spiritual light, your resilience. They have made pacts, whispered prayers of lack and limitation against your destiny. They are the hidden block, the spiritual thief assigned to intercept this blessing, and they are activating their final strategy now. Heaven is watching their every move. Your entire life, you have felt different. You felt out of place, as if you were born in the wrong time or the wrong family. You have intuitions that come true. You see glimpses of future events in your dreams. You feel the energies of rooms and people, and you've been told you are too sensitive. My beloved, this was not a flaw. This was your divine antenna being fine-tuned to receive this very transmission. God specifically chose you for this hour because your spirit is strong enough to bear the weight of this revelation and this glory. Do not skip this message. Your 7-day countdown has already begun. Let me deepen the revelation for you, my child. This is not merely about currency. This is about coronation. The $777,000 is a symbol, a numerical key representing complete spiritual perfection and fulfillment. The 7-fold completion of God's promise made manifest in the physical realm. It is the financial resource required to launch you into your ultimate divine purpose without the constraints of lack. This is the fuel for the mission you agreed to undertake before you ever took your first breath on earth. That strange feeling you had about that person in your life, the one you dismissed as paranoia, heaven says your intuition was not wrong. The individual working against you has a specific signature. They are a water sign in the zodiac, and they have a hidden mark, a small scar on their left hand, received in an accident they never truthfully explained to you. They have spoken words of blessing to your face, but in their private moments, in their journal, they have written down your dreams and claimed them as their own, invoking dark forces to divert your destiny to their path. They see your pending miracle as their rightful inheritance. I validate the profound grief you have carried, the grief of opportunities that vanished without explanation, the grief of loans falling through at the last minute, of job offers retracted, of contracts dissolving like mist. You wept, wondering what you had done wrong. You have prayed, fasted, and given your last coin in faith, only to see your bank account remain stagnant. My beloved, this was not a test of your faith from God. This was spiritual sabotage from the lower realms, orchestrated through a human agent who was jealous of the calling on your life. Your tears were collected in heavenly vials, and they have now tipped the scales of justice in your favor. The 7-day window is critical because the celestial alignment that allows for such a massive, unblocked transfer of wealth is closing. Planetary forces that aid in concealment are giving way to forces of revelation. This is why the antagonist is becoming desperate. They know their time to operate in secrecy is ending. They feel the shifting tides. They are making frantic calls, sending subtle, energy-draining messages, all designed to keep you in a state of confusion and doubt, to make you miss this window. You have 6 days and 22 hours now. Do not skip this warning. Heaven is watching you read this, and legions of angels are awaiting your command. Now I must expose the specific, damning evidence, my beloved, the proof that will liberate your mind from the prison of doubt. 3 days ago, this person was in a place of spiritual consultation, not a church, but a place of dark divination. They sought counsel on how to finalize a soul tie severance that would permanently reroute a financial inheritance from your bloodline to theirs. They used a personal item of yours, a photograph, a piece of jewelry you gifted them, or an item of clothing, as a point of contact for this ritual. They were told the ritual would be complete in 7 days, coinciding exactly with our heavenly deadline. You've always wondered why, at specific times, you would feel a sudden, unexplained drain of energy, a wave of depression or anxiety that had no root cause in your own life. It would often coincide with a moment of great potential or excitement for you. That was the energetic siphon being activated. They were feeding on your divine potential, leaching the miracle that was meant to manifest in your reality. The trembling in your hands as you read this is your spirit's recognition of this truth. At this very moment, they are feeling a cold dread. Their spirit is sensing that the veil of secrecy is being torn away. They may even attempt to contact you within the next 24 hours with a strange story or request, an attempt to check in and gauge your energy to see if you are still unaware. This is a critical moment. Do not engage with their narrative. Do not answer their call with vulnerability. Your silence is your sword. Your awareness is your shield. The clock is ticking, my child. You now have 6 days and 18 hours. Every minute you spend in hesitation is a minute they use to tighten their knots. But every second you spend in faithful reception of this word is a second where my angelic legions sever their dark cords with blades of holy fire. This is the emotional peak of your liberation. The pain of the past was the pressure that created the diamond of your unshakable faith. That faith is now the only currency required to access the divine treasury. Do not skip this moment of revelation. Claim your freedom. You ask, why would they do this? What is their motivation? The motivation is not merely greed, my beloved. It is a deep, spiritual bankruptcy and a profound fear. This individual is what we call a backup candidate. Their destiny was never meant to hold the level of light and abundance that yours was. They are a secondary vessel, but through envy and manipulation, they have tried to usurp a primary calling. They fear that if you step into your fullness, they will be exposed as empty, and their entire fabricated reality will collapse. Their actions are a desperate attempt to validate their own stolen identity. Heaven discovered this through your prayers. Your sighs, your tears, your unanswered questions, they created a frequency that could not be ignored. 7 weeks ago, a council was convened. The archangels presented the evidence of your faithfulness amidst unparalleled opposition. The saints interceded on your behalf, and the verdict was passed down from the highest court. Justice and recompense must be served. The 7-day deadline was set, not as a limit, but as a divine activation period for you. Here are your instructions, my child. This is crucial. First, you must speak it. Verbally, aloud, declare, I am the rightful heir. I break every illegal soul tie, every curse, every assignment of lack and diversion. In the name of the Most High God, I command the full and immediate transfer of my $777,000 miracle. It is mine by divine right. You must do this today. Second, you must forgive them, not for their sake, but for yours. Release them to God's court. Your forgiveness is not absolution for their actions. It is the final severance of the energetic hook they have in you. It is you taking your hand off them so that heaven's hand can move against them without your energy interfering. This is the hardest command, but the most freeing. You now have 6 days and 15 hours. The opposition is intensifying, but so is the angelic activity around you. You are surrounded by a host of warriors you cannot see, fighting battles you are only now becoming aware of. Trust this process. This is the second time I am imploring you. Do not skip this instruction. Your vocal declaration is the key that turns the lock in the heavenly realm. Heaven is watching your obedience. The consequences of ignoring this warning are severe, my beloved. If this 7-day window closes without you taking claim, the celestial conduit will be sealed. The $777,000 will not simply wait for you. It will be returned to the treasury and reassigned to another season, potentially years from now. Furthermore, the antagonist will believe their methods have worked, emboldening them to deepen their attacks on other areas of your life, your health, your relationships. You will remain in the cycle of lack, wondering what happened, never knowing how close you were. But the rewards of heeding this call are beyond your earthly imagination. This financial miracle is merely the down payment, the proof of your divine sonship and daughtership. It will come through unexpected channels. A legal settlement from a forgotten case, a distant relative's will you knew nothing about, a business idea that suddenly ignites, or a divine connection that leads to a prosperous partnership. It will be clearly supernatural, leaving no doubt in your mind that God Himself orchestrated it. I strengthen your validation now. Remember when you were 7 years old and you had that vivid dream of talking to an angel? That was me, my beloved. I was preparing you. Remember that time you were at your absolute lowest, ready to give up, and a stranger gave you a random word of encouragement that precisely fit your situation? That was a divine agent sent to steady you for this moment. Every moment of divine coincidence, every spared life, every inexplicable moment of hope was a breadcrumb leading you here to this truth. You have 6 days and 10 hours. The time frame is shrinking, but your faith must be expanding. The universe is responding to your conviction. The money is already looking for you, but it requires your faith as its homing beacon. Your feeling of being an outsider, of not fitting in, was because you were coded for a different reality than the one you were born into. You are not meant to fit into that old, lack-filled reality. You are meant to transcend it and create a new one, funded by heaven itself. Do not skip this crossroads. Why were you chosen? This is the question burning in your soul. You were not chosen because you are perfect. You were chosen because you are a warrior. You were chosen because when you were knocked down 7 times, you got up 8. You were chosen because your love for God and your innate kindness never turned to bitterness, even when you had every earthly reason for it to do so. Your spirit is forged in a furnace of adversity, making it strong enough to wield great abundance without corruption. There is a divine plan behind every struggle. The financial lack was to teach you stewardship of spirit over matter. The betrayal was to teach you discernment. The loneliness was to force you to develop a relationship with the divine that would become your unshakable foundation. You were being prepared for a throne, and thrones are not built in times of ease. They are carved in the pits of adversity. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they can handle the truth that will set them free. You've always wondered why your life path seems so much harder than those around you. Now you know. You were not in a race with them. You were in a training ground they could never comprehend. The magnitude of your destiny required a magnitude of preparation. The $777,000 is not a reward for a game well played. It is the deployment of resources for a mission that is now beginning. We are building to a second emotional peak, my child. Feel this truth surge through you. The past is not a chain, it is a foundation. Every tear is now a diamond in your crown. Every prayer is now a weapon in your arsenal. Every moment you felt forgotten, you were actually being sculpted. You now have 6 days and 5 hours. The final phases of the spiritual battle are underway. Your declaration of faith is the battle cry that assures our victory. Heaven is watching your response with bated breath. Do not skip this calling. Now I reveal the full specific manifestation, my beloved. The $777,000 will not arrive as a single check. It will come through 3 separate streams, each confirming the others. The first stream, approximately $300,000, will come from a legal or contractual source, something you had given up on. It will appear within 21 days of your faithful claim. The second stream, approximately $277,000, will come from a completely new, unexpected idea or invitation that presents itself to you within the next 14 days. The final $200,000 will come as a direct repayment of a spiritual debt from someone from your past, who will be compelled by a force they cannot understand to rectify a wrong. It will arrive in your life not with struggle, but with ease. It will feel like a divine correction, a settling of accounts that is long overdue. You will know it is from God because it will be accompanied by an overwhelming, tangible peace, a peace that surpasses all understanding. It will silence every anxious thought and every fearful voice, including the voice of the antagonist, who will be utterly confounded and exposed by its arrival. The funds are specifically for 3 purposes. First, to erase every debt, every financial chain that binds you to the past. Second, to establish a foundation of absolute freedom from which you can operate in your divine purpose without the pressure of lack. And third, to seed into the destinies of others, to become a conduit of breakthrough for those who are where you once were. This is why the amount is so specific and significant. You now have 5 days and 22 hours. The conduit is open. The heavenly bank is awaiting your withdrawal request, which is your faith. The angels are dispatched to move on the hearts of men, to unsettle forgotten accounts, to inspire new ideas, and to bring justice to your doorstep. Your only job is to believe, to receive, and to prepare your mind for a shift in reality that will be so sudden, it will leave you breathless with gratitude. Do not skip this revelation. Heaven is watching to see you believe for the specific number. This is your moment of empowerment, my beloved. This is where you break the generational curses of lack, of being the family's forgotten one, of never having enough. The cycle ends with you. The blessing is activated not by wishful thinking, but by a conscious, deliberate act of receiving your divine identity. You are not a beggar. You are a child of the King, coming to claim your inheritance. I activate your spirit now. I commission you as a financial general in the army of light. This money is your weaponry for the next phase of the war. It will fund shelters, feed the hungry, support ministries, and launch businesses that operate on principles of justice and light. Your struggle was never just about you. It was about the multitude you are destined to bless. This is the final and most direct call to action. The time for passive listening is over. The moment for active faith is now. Go to the private place. Get on your knees if you must. Lift your hands to the heavens. Shout your claim to the spiritual realms. Command the wealth of the wicked that has been stored up for the righteous to be released to you now. Do it with fire. Do it with tears. Do it with the authority of one who knows their identity. This is your divine right. Seize it. You have 5 days and 18 hours. The final battle for this miracle is happening in the unseen realm, and your faith is the decisive factor. Do not be calm. Be fervent. Be passionate. Your passionate claim shakes the heavens and terrifies the forces of darkness. They have held your blessing hostage for too long. Today, you serve the eviction notice. Do not skip this activation. Your amen is your signature on the divine contract. I seal this message with eternal promises, my child. You are vindicated. You are protected. A ring of fire surrounds you, and no weapon of the enemy, no rumor, no curse, no financial attack will prosper against you ever again. The same authority that commands heavenly armies now guards your destiny. You are eternally connected to the source of all provision. The antagonist will be exposed. Their schemes will unravel in a humiliating and public way. You will not need to lift a finger. Heaven's justice system will handle it. You will watch from a place of peace and safety, and you will have compassion for them, for they truly never knew the magnitude of the fire they were playing with. Now, my beloved, close your eyes. Feel my presence. Feel the legions of angels that now surround your dwelling place. Feel the financial breakthroughs already beginning to stir in the atmosphere around you. They are drawn to your faith like metal to a magnet. You are blessed. You are highly favored. You are the heir to a promise that cannot be broken. Go in peace. Go in power. Go in the absolute certainty that you are loved, you are chosen, and you are wealthy beyond measure. The God of the breakthrough goes before you. I, Archangel Michael, am your defender. The hosts of heaven are at your service. Claim your miracle. Receive your peace. Embrace your destiny. The 7-day countdown continues. 5 days and 15 hours remain. Do not skip your blessing. Heaven is watching, and so it is. Amen.